So friends, if we could please turn back in our Bibles, if you like, to Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, I'd like us to reread that text again together. So Luke 10, chapter 25 to 37. Title, The Parable of the Good Samaritan. We pick it up at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, and so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbour?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii. A denarii was worth about a day's wage for a labourer. Okay, so that's kind of an idea of how much it was. But he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Verse 36. "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hand of the robbers?" And the expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." So, in terms of a quick summary of what I've just read, Jesus is asked by an expert in the law, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And because he was asked this by a legal expert, Jesus asks him, "What is written in the law?" And the legal expert answers correctly. In verse 27, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, and with all your mind." Now that was a reference back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, actually. It comes out of a famous text called the Shema. But then he says, "Love your neighbour as yourself." And that is a reference back to Leviticus 19. So in terms of getting the content right, this expert in the law gets full marks. We would give him an A+, right? And so what does Jesus say? Jesus says, "You have answered correctly." Jesus replies, "Do this and you will live." But then, friends, notice the next part. Verse 29, "But the legal expert wanted to justify himself." Did you notice right back in the first verse that we read that the motivation of the legal expert was to test Jesus? And not only was he just putting him on the spot, he was putting Jesus on the spot in front of other people. So it's really important to understand that, yes, he's addressing the legal expert, but he's actually being put on the spot in front of a group. Okay? So the legal expert wanted to justify himself. And so that's an interesting statement. In other words, he understands what this means, but while he knows what it means, he's not putting it into practice. And in the classic way, and I say this out of all love and respect to any lawyers in the room this morning, but in that classic way that lawyers and experts do, This expert in the Old Testament law begins to look for a loophole. And so he asks Jesus this question: who is my neighbour? See, it brings a whole new weight to the text, right? And at this point, you can almost hear Jesus sigh. But notice how Jesus responds. He doesn't argue a point, he shares a story. And it's the story of a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and while he was travelling, he was attacked, he was robbed, he was badly beaten, and he was left for dead. Now, we're going to pause for a moment, and I want to give you an idea as to what the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was like. So if we could have the next slide. Thank you. Now, the top image will give you an idea of the elevation. The journey from Jerusalem to Jericho was about 27 kilometres, in which the elevation dropped by about 800 feet, right? So it's about 240 metres. And then if you look at the photo in the corner lower, that photo is only a few years old, you will see how thin the road is. And so this road, friends, was known for being dangerous, and historically people were often attacked. So when Jesus shares the story, there's a hint of familiarity that people would get. Now, as the story continues, we're introduced to two characters who in an Israelite society were of good standing, a priest and a Levite. And both of these men, upon seeing the bloodied man, crossed to the other side of the road. Now, when you look at that picture and you think about the photo that I had up just before, the road is not wide. And in order for these men to cross over to the other side, it was an act of deliberate avoidance. And this is the point that Jesus was trying to make. Now, in their defense, because of who they were, if the Levite and the priest thought he may have been dead, then according to Old Testament law, which they were bound under, these men had to go through a huge purification process. If they touched a dead body, it just took a long time to sort out. But Jesus here was making a subtle point, because he was saying really that the rules had become so overbearing that they were more important than the well-being of people. No, I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole. So the people who were listening to Jesus were probably disappointed that these two supposed heroes didn't do anything to help. And then Jesus, being Jesus, shares in a way that deliberately shocks his listeners. Jesus introduces the hero of the story, a Samaritan. And what we often miss is that when we read this is that the Israelites hated the Samaritans. And so Jesus here was intentionally offending his audience. And he was about to really offend this legal expert. You see, anyone who was a Samaritan had a genealogy that was half Jewish and half Assyrian. They were the descendants of the northern kingdom who had been taken into captivity by Assyria a few hundred years before. And because of that, then a lot of the women ended up having children by Assyrian men. And so in Jewish society, a Samaritan was an outcast. They were hated by the Israelite people, even though technically they were half brothers and sisters. And then the scandal continues. Unlike the priest and the Levite, the Samaritan takes pity on the victim. The text says that he pours oil and wine on the wounds. Not a cheap thing to do, by the way. He bandages the wounds. And then he finds medical help and accommodation. And then he offers to pay ongoing expenses. Notice the generosity in the actions of the Samaritan. So friends, the audience who was listening to this at the time would have been shocked. And in fact, they probably just sat there in silence as they were processing what Jesus was saying. And in that moment, so let's say that silence happens, look at how Jesus finishes. While everyone was listening, Jesus turns to the legal expert and says, in verse 36, "Which of these three do you think was a neighbour to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" And the expert in the law replied, and it could probably say replied reluctantly, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus then told him, "Go and do likewise." So friends, there is no loophole. The neighbour was the one, according to Jesus, who loved the beaten man and helped him, expecting nothing in return. It was his actions that defined him as the neighbour. And according to Jesus, and according to the Old Testament law, this is the true meaning that is embedded there. Now, fast forward to the 1800s. One of the founders of the Salvation Army, General William Booth, reads this parable, and then he makes the statement, he says that we are a Good Samaritan people. And in fact, this parable became a huge motivation for our theology and our doctrines and why we do what we do. Not too many people realise this. But in other words, what General Booth was saying was that as a movement, as the Salvation Army, we don't look away, we get involved. Now, because next weekend is Congress weekend, which is as I think we've covered that this morning, but the semi-annual, or however often it turns up, gathering of the territorial-wide expression of the Salvation Army, New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, I thought it would be a good idea to unpack this idea of being a Good Samaritan people. I want to share some of the history behind this motivation. Why? Because, friends, the Salvation Army, the story of the Salvation Army, if you're sitting here in the hall this morning, this is part of your story. This is part of our story. And it's an exciting story. So, here we go. Now, I've tried, it's school holidays, so hopefully there's lots of pictures and all sorts of things. But anyway, William Booth, that was his brother, no, anyway. William Booth grew up in Nottingham, England, and William's dad died when he was 13 years old. And when he was 13, he became a pawnbroker. Now, for those of you that don't know, a pawnbroker is someone who lends money at interest on the security of an item, a bit like a second-hand dealer, or probably a little bit more like cash converters actually today. And by the way, I always find it interesting, that when movements are founded, there's so much that happens in that first generation that influences the movement as a whole. And I wonder as to whether this is where we kind of have our family stores. You know what I mean? But anyway, as he got older and he developed his trade, he then became a preacher in something called the Methodist New Connection. And at some point, he meets Catherine and they fall in love. And everyone go, oh. Now, Catherine was, I think, William's greatest weapon. She was someone who was very sharp, she was very clever, she was very well read. And in fact, the Salvation Army has become what it has because, I believe, of the influence of Catherine. She was an incredibly influential and clever woman. Now, a number of years after they were married, one night, so the story goes, William was out walking through the East End of London, and he comes home and he says to his lovely wife, "Kate, I have found my destiny." And in later years, William would summarise his destiny in an autograph book of King Edward. And he wrote these words up here. He says, "Some men's ambition is art, some men's ambition is fame, some men's ambition is gold, but my ambition is the souls of men." And so William Booth was originally an evangelist. a street preacher, and he would preach amongst the socially challenged masses of East London. Poverty was rife, social issues were rife, life expectancy was low. If you lived in that space, life expectancy at one point was as low as 35. Crime was high, and many people were addicted to alcohol. And over time he came to see that the preaching of the gospel was useless unless people could be helped physically as well. And he would write in latter years these words, "But what is the use of preaching the gospel to men whose attention is concentrated upon a mad, desperate struggle to keep themselves alive?" And on top of this, when he did preach and when people accepted Christ, a number of things would happen. Because the original intent was for people to get saved and then be referred to their local church. That was the original intent. But new believers wouldn't go to churches when they were sent. And when they did, they weren't wanted in those spaces, often because they weren't in the right social class. Friends, at that time, it was very common for families and people to purchase their pews. You had to rent your pew, right? And then there was on the outer wall was a place where people could sort of sit. But however, these people that were turning up who were living on the streets were often very smelly and just not socially acceptable. But because of this, a more permanent organisation began to develop because William would recruit new Christ followers to help with the work of the mission. Now, as time goes on, more people get involved and they begin to call themselves the Christian Mission. And William Booth held the position of General Superintendent. We would call that position today something like the Chief Moderator, if that makes sense. But then one day in 1878, William Booth was reading a printer's proof of the annual Christian Mission Report, and he read aloud these words: "The Christian Mission is a volunteer army." And one of the other guys in the room, a guy called Elijah Cadman, upon hearing those words said, "I'm not part of a volunteer army, I'm part of a Salvation Army." And so William Booth, upon hearing that, he crossed out the words volunteer army and replaced it with the words the Salvation Army. Guys, that's how the Salvation Army was born. People think, oh, it must have been great planning and the whole thing. No, it wasn't. It was an accident. And where it gets really funny is that Elijah Cadman then says, oh, you're the general superintendent. That makes you the general. And then they all started handing out ranks to themselves. Done. That's how it was. Initially, it wasn't intentional. And I sort of smile because I think the forming of the Salvation Army was probably more of a bit of an accident in one sense. But anyway, one of the distinctive features of the Salvation Army, especially thanks to the amazing woman that Catherine was the empowerment of female leadership. And this is significant because back in the day in Victorian England, this concept was virtually unheard of, especially in church circles. But William Booth would later write, most of my best men are women. And because the Booths would recruit new believers, both men and women, it paved the way for a group of people who would become what Dr. Malcolm Irwin calls unlikely radicals. Now, at the time the Salvation Army was birthed, it coincided with the expansion of the British Empire. And in England itself, at its height, the Salvation Army planted on average 5 new churches every week. Right? Think about the story of how long it took Javel to get going. But these churches turned up everywhere. They were in like halls, back alleys. I read about one that met in a pig stall. That was just the energy and the enthusiasm that was going on at the time. But then it went global. And so the need for volunteers, soldiers and officers became urgent. Now there's a famous William Booth quote, which I think captures the sense of urgency quite nicely. And it says this, he was speaking to a young guy and he says this: make your will, pack your box, kiss your girl, and be ready to go in a week. And that was his recruitment method. And because that was his recruitment method, I want to introduce you to some of these unlikely radicals. And I want you to look at the age of some of these people. All right? So in 1885, William Booth recruits a guy called George Scott Railton. And in this picture, he's older. But when he was younger, he was recruited alongside 6 young women to go and, excuse the language, but invade the United States of America. And these girls were in their late teens and early 20s. And they left behind everything in England to go and do this. For these girls, it was a one-way trip. When it came to invading Canada in 1882, Booth recruited Captain Jack Addy and Lieutenant Joe Ludgate, who were both 19 years of age. And then when they landed in Canada, the work took off so fast that he sent reinforcements in the form of Captain Abby Thompson, who was also 19 years of age 1 year later. When it came to invading France, Booth sent one of his own, his daughter Katie. She was 23 at the time. And then 1 year later, she did time in prison in Switzerland for preaching the gospel in the street. Katie, by the way, is incredible to research. She was an incredible young lady. Another guy by the name of Elijah Cadman, who I've already referenced. Well, the significance of him was he started out as a kid as one of these kids that used to sweep chimneys. So they used to send kids up chimneys because they were small to clean the chimneys. And then in his teenage years, he was known for street fighting. He was introduced to alcohol at the age of 6, and he was a short guy. He was only around 5 foot high when he became an adult. When he was 21, he became a Christian, and him and his young wife, Maria, served in the ranks of the Salvation Army, and in England would hold meetings in which thousands and thousands of people would come to. And actually, it was his idea that we should all wear uniforms. I'll look at this and go, thanks, Elijah. But anyway. And I think he might have been the first one to reference William Booth as being the general. But anyway, this short guy, completely unimpressive by worldly standards, his preaching took him to the West Indies, to South Africa, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, Scandinavia, and Germany, and a host of other countries. He's pictured here with a guy called Dr. Reed Hamilton, who was affectionately nicknamed the Giant. And so you got the short guy and this big guy. And because of this, it was a great public relations thing and used to attract huge crowds. But it was always about preaching the gospel. Now, when it came to New Zealand, Booth recruited 2 young guys, Captain George Pollard, who was 20, and Lieutenant Edward Wright, who was 19, to open fire in New Zealand. Basically, he gave them some loose change and said, go and plant the Salvation Army in New Zealand. They arrived in April 1883, and by 1 year later, they had planted 30 corps, they had trained 60 officers, and there were already rescue homes in most of the main centres in New Zealand. And by way of other interesting information, the first 5 Salvation Army Corps in New Zealand were Dunedin, Auckland, Christchurch, Wellington, and Timaru. Back in the day, you used to go to Dunedin, and the catchphrase would be, welcome to the number 1 corps in the country, because they were the first. It was good humour. But at the end of 1 year being here in New Zealand, they had a gathering here in Wellington of which over 5,000 people attended. Now, you think, oh yeah, but friends, the population of our country wasn't even 1 million people, right? When you think of that, that's actually quite an impact. So those are some of the examples that make, the library's huge, right? But lots of young people were recruited to preach the gospel and grow the movement. But now, let's talk about practical action, love in action, what we call Good Samaritan activity, or what I call rolling up your sleeves and getting down and getting dirty. The Salvation Army has often been referred to as love in action, or Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. And by the way, the blue epaulets on a soldier's uniform, we don't have too many soldier uniform people around here, but you'll see them wear blue epaulets that have got two S's on. The two S's literally mean save to serve. And it's a reminder to the person wearing it what the motivations behind wearing it are. But William Booth once said, "If I thought I could win one more soul to the Lord by walking on my head and playing the tambourine with my toes, I would learn how. Work as if everything depended upon work, and pray as if everything depended upon prayer. Do whatever it takes." And so I thought I'd quickly share some examples of those who have gone before us, doing whatever it takes to achieve the mission. So what is the mission of the Salvation Army? The mission of the Salvation Army is to care for people, transform lives and reform society through God in Christ by the Holy Spirit's power. And here at Johnsonville, we've reworded this for our context. The mission of the Salvation Army here in Johnsonville is to help people find Jesus, follow him, and make a positive difference in our world. This is why we do what we do. But what does this actually mean? Well, I think it means that starting with the proclamation of the gospel, we shouldn't be afraid to debunk the status quo, we should be innovators, and we shouldn't be afraid to take risks. And here are some historical examples of this. Now, some of you will know this one. Lights in darkest England. In 1891, General Booth took steps to fight two evils: the use of phosphorus in the manufacture of match heads, and secondly, the underpayment of employees. As a summary statement, employees who worked in factories that made matches were dying from phosphorus poisoning. And that was a horrific way to die, very painful. And you glowed, phosphorus. But they were also being underpaid in the process. The red head matches, friends, that we have today, not many people realise this, but they were actually a Salvation Army invention. They were invented to combat the old green-headed ones that were common at the time. It turned out, after the research had been done, that they were safer to produce and they were cheaper. And after a coordinated strategic approach from the factory floor to Parliament, the Salvation Army effectively ran all the opposition match factories out of business. They achieved fair pay for people, and then, once this was put in place, they closed up shop because the change had been enacted. Right? So that was one example, I think a massive story in itself. On another occasion in Victorian England, the Salvation Army went to war over the price of bread. They argued that it should be a human right for people to access bread, and so it should be affordable. And so to cut a long story short, they came up with a formula on how much bread should cost against the average wage. And this too ended up being endorsed at a parliamentary level. Then there was something that would be called the maiden tribute of modern Babylon. Now, this is one of my favourite ones for a number of reasons. But this was named after a series of articles a famous reporter by the name of W.T. Stead wrote exposing child prostitution in Victorian England. So upon being made aware that young girls in Victorian England were being purchased by wealthy men for entertainment purposes, the Salvation Army set up about exposing this to the wider public. In fact, they set up a kind of sting operation to show how easily this could be done. So alongside W.T. Stead, the Salvation Army embedded a young girl, Eliza Armstrong, who volunteered for this, into the system and then purchased her for £5. And in the process, they effectively demonstrated how easy it was to purchase a girl. And naturally, this got a lot of attention from the press. However, I think this would make a good movie, personally. However, when it came out that the Salvation Army themselves had purchased a girl, a number of them went to prison. But the outcome was, friends, that the age of consent was set by law to be 16 years of age. That's where the age of consent comes from. Even here in New Zealand was influenced by that law. I think that's pretty cool. On another note, I want to introduce you to this guy, Australia's Fighting Mac, aka Major William Mackenzie. He was a World War I Salvation Army military chaplain. And this guy was amazing. And it's interesting, each year around Anzac Day, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but on certain channels, there is a documentary that tends to come on which celebrates chaplains of World War I. And this guy is one of the main guys they talk about. But unlike the other chaplains, he was the first chaplain to actually be with the troops in the trenches on the front line rather than in the tents back on the beach. And on a couple of occasions, he actually ran into battle with the troops. The only difference being was he never carried a gun. And after the fighting had ended, he began the process of burying the dead and collecting the deceased information for their families. He would draw maps and diagrams as to where their bodies could be found. Following the war and after his death, he was recognised for his work by both the Australian government and the Turkish government for the way in which he didn't discriminate. We're not sure, by the way, if a Muslim government has ever bestowed an award on a born-again Christian either before or since. But they did this because he was just as careful to record the information regarding the Turkish soldiers as he did the Anzacs. Now, where it gets amazing is that the stories go, the Turks would see him in action from their lookout posts, and they issued an order that he wasn't to be shot because they could see what he was doing. And because of this, when talks needed to happen to negotiate a withdrawal, he was one of the key negotiators, which I think is quite amazing. Then, on another part of the world, during the same years, we come to these amazing people called the Donut Girls. So, meanwhile, on the Western Front in World War I, the Salvation Army sent a group of young girls who were mainly teenagers to the front lines to help in any way they could. Oh my goodness, it was a different time. I'm trying to think now of all of the mediations we'd have to have with parents if we sent their teenagers off to war. But anyway, one of the girls used what ingredients they could find, and she inadvertently invented a donut with a hole in the middle. And so this became popular with the troops. So much so that many of them became ardent supporters of the Salvation Army after the war. Even today, if you go into an RSA dressed like this, more often than not, you come out with cash thrown at you. It's quite an amazing thing that happens, but it comes back to this. Some of these veterans founded, by the way, their own donut businesses when they went home. And what was the design of the donuts? They had a hole in the middle. So I would argue that Dunkin' Donuts and Krispy Kremes and all that may have had their origins back here. Now, the interesting thing is that following World War I, some of these girls became minor celebrities. They were on the cover of magazines, Cosmopolitan magazine there, for example, simply because the troops that came back had this warm affection for what these girls did. Now, a number of years earlier, in Australia, a guy by the name of Major James Barker was concerned about the number of men who would be released from prison and then quickly reoffend. And he came up with the idea of meeting them at the prison gate when they were released. He had set them up in a structured program and helped them re-enter society. And this gave birth to what we would call prison gate homes. Here in New Zealand, Captains Albert and Sarah Burfoot, who were only in their 20s at the time, picked up this idea, and thanks to their passion for this, prison gate homes spread throughout most of New Zealand. And we still do prisoner reintegration today. By the way, one of the properties they started in 1897 is now what we would call Epsom Lodge today. It's still going strong 130 years, something later. Now, this one should interest all the photographers in the room. Another guy, Joseph Perry, who was a photographer, started a process by which his photos could move in an animated way. Effectively, he invented the first slideshow. And I remember the first time I came across this, I was actually flying to Australia on a Qantas aircraft, and I was reading the In-Flight magazine, in which the article attributed the Salvation Army for pioneering what would become the movie industry in Australia and New Zealand. Not many people know that. And so his Limelight Brigade would travel around showing slides about Bible stories and the gospel message. And this was hugely innovative. Then there were these ladies, Annie Rudman and Miss Brownlee. They started to care for prostitutes in their own homes. And this led to a network of rescue homes throughout the country. And their story is amazing. And then another lady picked up on their idea, Annette Paul, who was only 25 at the time, and she started rescue homes providing rehabilitation for women who were coming out of prostitution. And her story is amazing. Then on a little bit of another story, heaps of information here, but very cool things. The Salvation Army in Gisborne. There's our home core. But I was shocked and amused to find out that how that came into being was that there were three young guys that wandered into town one day, and this was back in the 1800s, and they made a ruckus on the main street, and they were arrested, and they went to prison for 3 days, and when they were released, they went back to the main street, made another ruckus. By this time, the local newspaper got involved, and so they went back to prison a second time. This is in Joan Hudson's book, As for Me and My House. It's a great read. And then when they came out of prison, they had created such an interest that they had a Sunday meeting and had over 200 people turn up. That's how the Salvation Army in Gisborne was born. Once that was established, they then moved on, and I think it was to Hastings, where they went to the main street, created a ruckus in the main street, right? Now, I try and think about that today in terms of we have a public relations department, and how would that work? But it's an amazing story. Now, on another note, I've included this one for all of you musos in the room. Some of you will have heard of the joy strings. And it's funny when you listen to them. But these in fact, I have to say, the guys had some really good guitar riffs going on for its time. But these guys effectively wrote some songs, set it to contemporary music, and this was at the height of Beatlemania. And next thing, they found themselves on the charts. And they had two songs in the UK charts and one song in the US charts, which is amazing, right? But when you listen to their music, it's all gospel proclamation stuff. Look, there's a lot of information there, but I thought this could be kind of interesting. I will just share two New Zealand examples by way of wrapping this up in one sense. In terms of doing what we do, sleeves rolled up, love in action, I have to mention the Christchurch earthquake. You know, this earthquake happens, and within hours, there's about 50 people that have been deployed by the following morning from our networks. and meeting people who are genuinely broken with what's happened, and I've shared stories about that. And then something that came out of that, what I experienced personally, so I was part of the first wave, but something that happened in that space was, and I got steamed about it, was the money lenders were out in force. And so I remember seeing piles of liquefaction, all of the big piles of sand, and seeing a vehicle cruise up and down the street with a sign, "Need money now?" Right? So initially, I just thought that was interesting. And then we started working with a lady only in the first week who had taken a loan, but the interest was just horrendous. And so I went with her to pay off her loan and was met by a very aggressive man who was really annoyed that I was settling her debt. Cut a long story short, when I was flying back from the earthquake, I was in Wellington, passing through Wellington. We were living in Auckland at the time, literally waiting in the airport, and a guy that we knew, a guy called Craig Kitto, who was working for the police, happened to be there. And he asked me the question, how was it, in Christchurch? And I shared with him what I'd experienced, because this was on top for me, because I was steamed about it. And so he went, there's someone else here we should have a chat to. And so he went and grabbed some government official. I can't remember his name. And the three of us were sitting at the table, and he wanted to hear my story. Now, I don't know whatever came out of that. But something that we did as a movement leads to the next thing, was something called the Good Shop. Came into being. Some of you may have heard of this or not heard of this, but it was a mobile shop that would go around, set up in a way to combat all of the loan sharks. And that only operated for, 4 years, about that, eh? And then it was wrapped up. But this was a very innovative thing. So isn't that cool? I think it's very cool. Now, the last slides here, we're going back to our State of the Nation. When it comes out, read it. It's awesome, but I don't have time to go into that. The last slides here, William Booth's funeral. He died on the 20th of August, 1912. And at his funeral in the streets, it was estimated that over 1 million people turned up to that. So these are some of the pictures. He laid in state, which is an honour in the UK for people who have made a contribution to wider society. And he laid in state for 3 days, and in 3 days, 150,000 people came to pay their respects to him. And then on the last, I think there's another one. Oh, that's right. Some dodgy guy by William Booth's headstone. And Jules took that, I heard her say that. So we have an amazing history, people associated with us. And I think it's up to us to kind of keep the original flame burning, right? This is our story. That's why I love being a part of the Salvation Army. I love doing what I do. But I love being connected with a great group of people who, some of you are very innovative, and it's very exciting. But as a closing thing, as we think of the words of Jesus and the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan, he looks at the legal expert, and what does he say? Go and do likewise. And so for us, what does that mean? And so I'd like to invite the team forward now. And there's not going to be a massive response time this morning. What I would like you to ponder on is, what does it mean in my life to go and do likewise? Are there people that I know that actually, they do need a little bit of assistance or help in a way that maybe other people are ignoring? That could be one thing. I think this does take multiple forms. I think part of it is also about making sure that we proclaim the gospel, but in doing so, that this is the heart of what we proclaim, right? Faith and works go hand in hand. So that's where I'm going to leave the message this morning. But may you be blessed as you ponder these things.